Now that you've properly adjusted the luminance of an image, you want to make sure that it's white balanced and that the saturation is appropriate for the shot. To better get our heads wrapped around how some of these sliders work and affect an image, let's go back to our scopes, and I have 3 scopes open. I have my vector scope, I have my RGB parade, and I have my waveform, and I have that set to just Luma. Now, if you look at the way this gray card appears on the scope, from the color standpoint, and that's the vector scope, it's a perfect dot. That means there is no color information at all. If we look at our RGB parade, the elements of red, green, and blue are all equal, again providing us a neutral image. And of course the waveform is stuck at 50% because there's really not a lot of difference from gray to gray to gray. Now let's move some of the sliders and see how they affect the image. So we're going to go over to the Lumetri Color Effects panel, and I'm going to simply grab the temperature adjustment and move the slider to the left, and this will add more blue to the image. It will cool off the image. That's an expression we use when an image is a little more blue. And watch what happens to my scopes as I move this to the left. First of all, we see that the blue part of the RGB parade is now much higher. The green hasn't moved at all, and there's less red in the image. And visually we see that this gray image has turned blue. If we go over to our vector scope, and I'm going to bring this full frame for just a moment by hitting the tilde key, you can see that where the dot was dead center before, now it's moving over in between blue and cyan, reflecting the color of the new image, or the grayscale image that's now blue. Let's go back to full screen and take a look at what happens when we move the lower slider, the tint slider. I'm going to reset the temperature by double-clicking on it. Once again, we're a nice neutral gray, but if I grab the tint slider and move it towards green, what you'll notice is that the green moves up and the red and blue move down simultaneously. So you're really affecting the relationship between the green part of the image and the red and the blue. If I move it the other way, you'll notice they'll pass each other, and now the red and the blue are dominant, giving us a purple image, and the green is lower. And if you take a look at your vector scope, you see that our dot has moved closer to the magenta and red area. If I now move the saturation slider, I'm going to go ahead and make this more saturated. You'll notice 2 things happening. The little dot in the vector scope moves towards the edge of the circle, showing that the image is more saturated. And if you look at the RGB parade, you can see that the red and the blue have increased their intensity, and in this case with the green, it has further moved lower, again giving us dominant saturation. The next image in the sequence should be gray, but it has a blue color cast to it. I can see that with my eyes, but I can see that really easily with the vector scope and the RGB parade. I have a lot of blue in the image, so I'm going to grab my temperature slider and move it to the right, and what you'll see is that I'm adding red and removing blue. So let me take that over to the right, and they're pretty even, and I see that the color isn't quite gray yet, so I'm going to work with the slider that goes from green to magenta, and if I wanted to add green, I could. If I move it the wrong way, there we go, it's making it more purple, but I want to bring it just so that they all line up and my image is now neutral. There's no color cast at all. You can see this by the dot being dead center, and you can see here that the red, green, and blue traces are aligned. So now we understand how to color correct the hue in theory, but let's actually apply this to a clip that wasn't quite right when it was shot. So I have a lot of blue in the image, and often this can happen if, for instance, the white balance is set to the wrong color temperature, or maybe it just didn't auto white balance properly. Now I'm going to look at this image, and at first blush it looks okay. But if you really focus on it, you can see that it's actually a little bit too blue. And this is supported by the vector scope and the RGB parade. If you notice in the vector scope, we have a hint of excess blue and probably a little bit of red and magenta. This trace should be a little more central if everything was even. There's no real dominant colors in this image. But what's even more telling is in the RGB parade, I have way more blue information than red and green. And if we step back and look at our image, yes, there is a blue sky, but the clouds seem to be tinted a little bit blue also. Well, we did learn earlier that the first thing I like to do is make sure that my luminance is correct. So we could go back and go through all the sliders, but I'm going to take advantage of this auto button. And if you press the auto button, it really is dealing with the tonality. It's not going to affect color at all. It's just going to try to do its best guess on what is the brightest and darkest areas of the image and fix it. So I click this, brightens the image up a little bit. It's pretty close. Maybe I want to go ahead and make sure that my blacks are nice and rich. But really what we want to do is focus on color. So the first thing my gut says is I need to fix the blue part of the image. And I'm going to do this and look at both my vector scope and my RGB parade. So I go ahead and grab the temperature adjustment. And if I move it to the left, it's adding blue, which is making the image worse. But if I move it to the right, you can see that I'm adding red to the image and I'm getting rid of some of that blue cast. Unfortunately, there's a little bit too much red in the image. Those clouds don't quite look right. So now I can work with my tint control and notice if I move it left or right, it affects the ratio of red and blue to green. So I'm moving it a little bit more to the green, making these all pretty equal. And if we take a look at our image and turn on and turn off our adjustment, we can see where we were and where we are. Now I like my images to pop a little bit with color, so I can go ahead and grab the saturation slider and move it a little bit to the right. And as long as the traces in the vector scope do not exceed my targets, I should be pretty good. So there's my after image. If I hit the F key, I can match frame to the before image. And as you see, I'm going from something that's a little blue and red to an image that really shows the ground, the mountains to be the right color, and I have nice white puffy clouds. As you can see, by just staying in the basic correction segment of the Lumetri color effects panel, I can easily repair a shot and move on.